it's interesting to look at some of the things that Americans overall agree on. Like actually, some of the most recent surveys on gun violence have most of Americans in the same place on a lot of things. Like the people who support universal background checks, it's like 90% of the country. What other situation does 90% of the country agree on? I can't think of very many things. It is in the 80s for people who think we shouldn't be selling firearms to people who have, violent crimes under their belts. It is well over half of Americans, and that number continues to rise, not for nothing, for the things that we all experience. That number continues to rise, that over half of Americans are in favor of an assault rifle ban. That's encouraging to hear, but what's so incredibly discouraging is that these facts and figures are not new ones, that this has been the case for at least, going on a decade now. And what has happened? And what has happened? That nothing on the actual justice level of things, on the actual legal of things, has actually happened. That is so discouraging. Like, I thought we were at a tipping point. I thought we were there. I thought we were at the point where things would actually change, because this is a democracy. We elect these people. They're supposed to do what the people believe, and the people agree on this. What is happening? And it's so discouraging to see that, to see nothing changes. And we see it, in Missouri too, when it was just recently that all of these people rallied around a petition for, Medicaid, Medicare expansion, and then what the legislators did was made it not come on ballot, made it not happen. And this just happens all the time, like with folks who are taking petitions right now to get reproductive rights on the ballot, and what's happening is that they're trying to raise the number of people required for a petition. That's not justice. That's not right. And I tell you what, nothing has made me lose faith in the fact that things can change than the fact that the death toll in Gaza is over 30,000 people now. It's over 30,000 people. And yet we still just are supporting, financially backing that as a nation. And so I stand here and I look at that and I'm like, how do I believe in anything? How do I believe in anything? They're all liars. They're all just like pulling one over on us, and it makes you just want to lose hope. It makes me just want to lay down and do nothing, because what's the point of it? Now, then I pause because I remind myself, for one thing, it's not the truth that we're hopeless. And it's also not helpful to tell myself or anybody else that story. It's not hopeful, and it is not helpful. So what can we tell ourselves about? What do we do when we lose faith completely? What do we do when we look at a system? Systems are supposed to be designed to help people, to lift people up. We live in a democracy because we want to lift people up. We want fairness for people. We want justice. We want goodness to prevail. And then when it doesn't, we get angry. And what Jesus did when he got angry, he sure in the world did not sit down. That guy came in with rage. He flipped over the tables. He was throwing things around. He was driving people out. He was railing against the system that was keeping people from God. So here you have this situation where, okay, your sacrifice is required, but you don't have the money for that. You're sure out of luck. You have a barrier between you and God. So this is what Jesus does all along, is trying to break down systems that separate people from God. Every time we see Jesus in Scripture, he's trying to break down barriers that separate people from one another and people from God. And that's an important thing that we see here. And this is also not a new thing. That structures, again, the structures that are built to make society function, to make the wheels chug along, to make things work, to make things better, that those are broken. And that rather than being conduits for us finding justice, they become barriers for us finding justice. This is not new. We work to overturn things, we work to flip things over, and what do we find? We find mess. So what can we do? I recently read a story about a man named Daryl Davis. He is a super talented musician. Daryl plays everything. He plays, I mean, he's a pianist who he plays blues, he plays jazz, he plays rock and roll, he plays country, he plays everything. And he has played in bars all over America, oh gosh, for 40 years now. And it was in 1983 that he was playing at the Silver Dollar Lounge, which was kind of a cowboy bar. And he, that night, happened to be the only black guy in the room and was really ripping it up on the keys. And a guy came up to him afterwards and was like, I've never heard a black man play like that. And he was like, where do you think the white guys learned to play? Like, where do you think this came from? And so they started having a conversation, and this guy was 15, 20 years older than Daryl, and he was like, how has he never heard a black man play on the keys? And the guy's friend was kind of nudging him, saying, tell him, tell him, tell him. So finally, the man did tell him. The reason he'd never heard a black man play like that on the keys before was because he was a member of the KKK. He hadn't exactly been spending a lot of time with anybody of color in any meaningful context, no conversations. So he and Daryl talked for a really long time, and Daryl, this gracious, gorgeous human, just had the space within him to sit with this guy and realize and decide, like, hey, people who are a part of this hate organization are not having a lot of conversations with people who have my skin color. So he decided he wanted to go deliberately start doing some research, understanding the organization, and start having conversations with members of the KKK. Intentional interviews and conversations. And he said, I became friends with all of these people. I found ways to love all of these people. And just saying it out loud, I feel really churny and weird, and I don't know how to make sense of it, but still it is the truth. And Daryl often, he's written a book, he's the coolest guy. He's been in movies, he's written a book, he speaks all over the country about this. He was riding a car with one of these men that he was interviewing. He was driving. I guess this man was a cyclops in the KKK, and they're driving along, and the man was telling him about how black people are inherently inferior. Like this was what this man was standing upon. He was like, just that black people are inherently more violent. And Daryl was like, I've never committed a crime in my entire life. And the man said, that's because you have a gene in you, but your gene is latent. It just hasn't come out yet. And Daryl just sat there, and the guy kind of looked at him like, see, I got you on that one. And then he sat there for a minute, and he thought, and then what I don't know how he had the brilliance to say this. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. He said, well, white people are serial killers. White men are serial killers. And the guy was like, what? And Daryl said, well, name to me 3 black serial killers. Of course, he couldn't. Daryl could name 10 off the top of her head. I could name 10 off the top of my head when I was like 11. Because he was like, white people, there's just a gene in you. You become serial killers. And the man said, I've never killed anybody in my life. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And Daryl was like, yeah, man, it is. You're right. It is a dumb thing. Do you hear it now? Do you hear how, that is just a dumb thing for me to say about you, and it's just as dumb of a thing for you to say about me? It was just a conversation. But not 5 months passed when that man who sat in the car with him left the KKK and gave his robe to Daryl. And Daryl took the robe, and he didn't burn it or trash it, he kept it. And over time, more people started leaving the organization and giving Daryl their robes. He has 200 sets of robes at this point in time. He continues his work to this day, he's still going around doing all this work, collecting all of these robes, and there are more than 200 people out there who are no longer a member of this hateful organization. But KKK still exists. It's not gone. We saw the insurrection in 2021. It's got a lot more fire than it's had even in some other recent years. So there's also this situation in the temple. Jesus flipped over the tables. He drove the money changers out, and the system is still broken. It might seem strange to pair these two stories together, Although, granted, like, we could flip through the Gospels and I could say, put a finger in, and odds are you land on a place where Jesus is sitting down and having a meal with people who he ardently disagrees with, and people who he has issues with, much like Daryl. But that's not what this passage is about. This passage is about Jesus having the fire of absolute righteous anger awoken in his soul and living into that anger. And I don't want to displace that for a second, because I think that's really important. So why would these two passages, why would this passage and this story ever be put next to each other if we're still saying that anger is important? Do you think that Daryl hasn't been horribly angry? Do you think that Daryl hasn't looked at these people who feel angry, violent, disturbed enough to want to string someone up from a tree, to want to burn down churches of people of color? Of course, he's angry. And in that anger, he sort of puts it this way. We've got two choices when we're angry, when the world stirs us up and makes us feel like we don't see reality, like it doesn't make sense to us. We've got two choices. We can sit down and watch how the world unfolds, or we can stand up and try to make it unfold in a different way. And the beautiful thing about this is, there is not just one way to be angry and to stand up. There are countless ways to be angry and to stand up. There is going to the protests. There's standing on the steps of the Capitol and yelling until your voice won't yell anymore. There's collecting signatures. There's adding your signature. There's sitting down with someone and having a meal and being willing to enter into very uncomfortable situations. There are putting your finances, putting your time, so many ways to put ourselves out there to stand up against the things that are wrong in this world. And I genuinely believe that each of us has a pull deep within us, that there is a way, a couple of ways, that there is something in us that calls us to enact a way for us to stand up, a way for us to use our anger that we are just most built for, most designed for in this dance of bending the arc towards justice. Because you know what? The arc of existence isn't just going to bend towards justice. It needs a little pressure put on it. We gotta push, we gotta pull, we gotta each have our say and have our part in this sacred dance. The systems are broken, there are things that need fixing, and we just have to apply some pressure, and maybe we won't be able to fix those systems. Maybe we can do some good in Missouri though. Maybe we can impact 200 hearts. Maybe we can impact 10 hearts. Maybe we can simply just change the one that is beating in our own chest. But no matter how many or how much or how big or widespread, this sacred work began long before us, and it will continue long after us. And we are integrally a part of God's story at work in this world. May we hear the call. May we heed the call. Do the hard thing of standing up and actually doing it. And may we be the living work of God's life, God's love, God's justice unfolding for all people. Amen.
Amen.